So I think that the Taiwan election is critical. The U.S. election less so because the two parties resemble each other with regard to China. But once we get through that period of uncertainty, what we'll see is that China's playing a long game and preparing for the eventuality of conflict rather than preparing for an imminent invasion.
We're talking about the latest developments in Russia, China, and all the major geopolitical hotspots that investors should be paying attention to. Matt Gertken is our expert guest. He is the chief strategist of the Geopolitical and U.S. Political Strategy Services of BCA Research. Matt, welcome to the show. Good to see you again. How are you?
Thank you, David. It's good to see you too. I'm doing well.
Good. Let's start with Russia. Now, after the mutiny attempt, that we saw a couple weeks ago, people are wondering whether or not Putin still has a tight grip over Russia. So let's start with that question before we recap what exactly happened.
Well, fundamentally, Russian domestic instability is a geopolitical trend that will have enormous consequences, even beyond the Ukraine war. And I think that's really the takeaway today. There's a lot of confusion and uncertainty, fog of war surrounding the Wagner events. But the Russian state has been decaying and destabilizing since the fall of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin tried to rehabilitate Russian power projection, and it's failed essentially in Ukraine. NATO is expanding. His natural gas energy cutoff has not worked. He's cutting off oil production, which will have mixed effects. And effectively, he's on the back foot on the battlefield. So what we're seeing is an instability in the Russian state. It's caused outward aggression, and it continues and will continue even after a ceasefire in Ukraine.
What do you think was the ultimate objective of Prigozhin?
It's very unclear, because if we take an external view and a big picture view, all we really know is that Prigozhin has been transferred out of southern Ukraine and is now circulating between Moscow and St. Petersburg and Belarus. And then Wagner troops may or may not regroup in Belarus, or they may be incorporated into the Russian armed forces. So it's not clear what we really saw. I mean, on the surface, it was a mutiny and a sort of negotiation between Prigozhin and Putin and the regime. But beneath the surface, it's possible that Putin is preparing a distraction in northern Ukraine to try to disperse Ukrainian forces that are concentrating for the counteroffensive in the south. And so I really would be reluctant to draw major conclusions simply because of the lack of information we have on what's really happening behind the scenes.
Well, what we do know is that the Wagner group was marching towards Moscow, then turned back in light of what appeared to be a deal between Prigozhin and the Belarusian president. Can we comment on that? What happened there?
Well, again, I would just highlight that Belarus has an interesting role and has continued to have an interesting role. If you think about it, back at the beginning of this conflict, if we go beforehand, in 2020, there was an election that Alexander Lukashenko flagrantly stole in Belarus, and it caused an upsurge in social unrest. Vladimir Putin was then looking at the risk of seeing both Ukraine and Belarus shifting to the west and maybe trying to pursue EU and NATO membership in Belarus as well as Ukraine. This would have completely broken the buffer regions that Russia has always been concerned about from a geopolitical point of view. And ultimately, it contributed to the decision to invade Ukraine and try to neutralize Ukraine as a Western-oriented actor. And that's where we see these kind of fundamental insecurities penetrating Russia and causing aggression. And now what we see is that Belarus has been kind of reincorporated into the Russian sphere. And Belarus is playing this interesting role where Putin has deployed tactical nuclear weapons there. And Lukashenko is playing some role as an interlocutor with Prigozhin and Putin. But again, I would be reluctant to draw decisive conclusions because what we've seen is that Prigozhin was able to go in and out of Russia since the mutiny, which calls into question whether it was in fact a mutiny or what will happen next.
Putin did promise retribution against the Wagner group. Can we recap what he's done so far and what he's planning to do next?
Well, the intention of the state was to incorporate the Wagner forces into Russia's conventional armed forces. And that's where Prigozhin ostensibly rejected what Russia was trying to do and and effectively had a quarrel with the state. And it just shows that these mercenary forces have an independent action, and it's an independent institution that doesn't necessarily have to do exactly what it's told, particularly in light of the troubles that the conventional armed forces are having in Ukraine, which has eroded their popular support. Prigozhin has benefited from some popular support. So we know that the incorporation process was resisted, and then and effectively, the march toward Moscow was a gambit to say, well, you're going to have to give us a better solution. But in the wake of, they weren't capable of invading Moscow. In the wake of that event, what we see is either those Wagner forces will be they'll be forced to reincorporate, or perhaps they will regroup in Belarus, which would support the hypothesis that Putin's preparing some kind of distraction in northern Ukraine.
There was some fighting between the Wagner Group forces and Russian forces outside of Moscow and nearby cities. But my question is, just from somebody observing the news, what where was the Russian military in all this? I mean, I know this is not a good parallel to make, but suppose any mercenary forces were to march on Washington, D.C. I don't think it's fair to assume that the U.S. forces would just sit idly by and do nothing and have the risk of a confrontation. So what was Putin doing with his military all throughout this after Rostov-on-Don was taken and then the march towards Moscow happened? What was the military doing?
Well, what you're pointing to is exactly my point, is that the Russian state is eroding. The state is supposed to have a total control or a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within its boundaries. And what we are seeing is that a mercenary group, a private company, can apparently challenge that monopoly or effectively supersede that monopoly in certain areas. And that's a reflection of the fact that Russia is losing control. They're losing central control. The armed forces are preoccupied and have suffered devastating losses in Ukraine. And that enabled the march on Rostov and ultimately up the highway. But it didn't enable an attack on Moscow, which of course is going to be extremely secure. And so I think what this shows is the erosion of the state, the instability of Russia, which will be a much more lasting theme. And that's why I'm calling attention to that, because, Ukraine, we might well have a ceasefire within 12 months. Certainly it's likely within 24 months. But what we don't know is how the world will deal with the much larger power vacuum of a continually eroding Russian state that lashes out in military campaigns, which further reduce the economic sustainability of the state and therefore further reduce the state's ability to hold on to the far-flung provinces and differing interests of the ethnic groups. So this is a Russia that's coming apart at the seams and has been coming apart for a long time. And I think that's the real takeaway here. And I think you should resist the stories that you're hearing from those who say, well, Putin has been strengthened by this event. He wasn't overthrown. He wasn't. That's true. But it doesn't strengthen him to, first of all, be subject to the sort of embarrassment that you're talking about, and also to face these setbacks on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Speaking of this vacuum that you brought up, I recall when all this was happening, even before the Wagner Group turned back, the question was whether or not Prigozhin could be the next president. Before any new information came in, I think that was one of the questions people had. But if not Putin, if not Prigozhin, who could fill that void?
Well, that's an interesting question. But again, I don't think it lends itself to macro analysis very well because, for example, Nikita Khrushchev was not expected to be the successor to Joseph Stalin back in the 1950s, but that's what happened. So in other words, the Kremlinologists were studying very closely the inner circle of Stalin, and none of them expected that Khrushchev would be the next Soviet leader. And I think that could very well be the dynamic that we see today. Basically, when the war is over, Vladimir Putin will become a liability to the regime. He will have the blood on his hands, but he will be standing in the way of economic normalization. the regime will need to try to get sanctions relief and try to restore and stabilize the economy. And Putin will constantly be frustrating those efforts simply because Western nations won't talk to him. And he'll be sort of marred with this legacy of the war, which will have, over the medium and long term, will have very significant negative effects for Russian households and businesses. So, in other words, Putin becomes a liability. The regime needs to move on, and at that stage, they could find someone completely different. I think the two theories are: one, you could end up with a sort of mad dog extremist nationalist if Putin is not willing to take extreme actions to save face in the war. And I think that is a risk, and maybe that was one that was highlighted. But that person would need to have access to the inner circle, and they would need to have some sort of power base in the inner circle. And we don't really see that that's the case, considering that Prigozhin was that sort of challenger from the outside and was in fact blocked, and the inner circle sort of circled the wagons. On the other hand, you could have an economic reformer come in, someone who's really not a military leader, and their sole purpose is to try to restore some diplomacy and economic cooperation with Germany and the EU.
Okay, let's talk about the Western response, or the likely Western response to all this. Some people have speculated that, in light of what we've seen, all that needs to happen to make Putin pull back, or perhaps negotiate a ceasefire deal in Ukraine, is to apply more pressure, which is exactly what Prigozhin did. First of all, do you agree with that analysis? And second, if that were true, could we expect more fiscal support for the war in Ukraine, which is to say more spending, more arms deals, more direct military support, perhaps?
I think Ukraine is at their peak momentum right now. They've had full-fledged support from the American administration, and that could change. That could change either because of negative effects of the war, which could cause the Biden administration to pull back support ahead of the election if they're worried that it could spiral out of control. Maybe, or more likely, if they had a change of party in the United States, you could see a marginal reduction of support for Ukraine. But even more to the point, Europe will eventually start to lose support for Ukraine. They have not been as supportive as the United States, but they've been going along with U.S. and Ukrainian policy, which has been to try to deliver a very significant pushback against Russia to punish them for trying to change borders with force and discourage any future states, or discourage Russia in the future from trying to change borders with force. But Europe will, over time, become much more concerned that the war, by dragging on, could spill out across borders and affect other countries. That there could be an escalatory spiral where Russia's losing control and becomes less predictable and more takes more drastic actions. And the Europeans are also facing rising domestic political instability as a result of higher energy prices. So effectively, Europe is likely to lose its appetite for strong support of the war. And that means that Europe supports the current counteroffensive from Ukraine, but in the future, if that offensive is bogged down and there's a stalemate, Europe will start to shift to a position of more negotiating ceasefire. And Russia, I think, can accept that, because Russia has not done well in this war and really is mostly focused on saving face and just retaining the territories that it's already annexed. And so I think that could, in fact, cultivate a ceasefire over time. But the short term is very much focused on Ukraine on the battlefield, how successful they will be defending their country, taking back their own territory, and the robust American support. So again, short term, strong U.S. support for Ukraine counteroffensive, and that's the important dynamic. But medium term, we're likely to see a loss of appetite among the Europeans, and Russia does want a deal in order to try to save face.
Given that domestic weakness was perhaps exposed, if you want to call it that, by this incident in Russia, how do you think this is going to affect foreign policy between the U.S., particularly the U.S. and Russia, for the next administration? We are 1 year ahead of the election.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And since, we don't really know the outcome, I think Democrats are favored right now for the White House. But if there's a recession, that will change. So recession odds are not low. And that means that it's very up in the air, the U.S. election. I think the one takeaway that is often overlooked is that either Biden or Trump would be a second-term president. basically an elderly second-term president who would be willing to take actions that would effectively defend U.S. national interests, even at the expense of the economy, because they can't get reelected. And those are actions that can be, harder for people like me to predict, but they can also be more jarring for other countries because effectively the U.S. is a more insulated and a more capable country, and that means that there's a lot of room for the U.S. to deal surprises if the president is willing to take risks. And that's very different than a circumstance where, if President Biden has to step down due to old age or illness or something like that, and you have Vice President Kamala Harris stepping up for the Democratic ticket, or if President Trump is imprisoned or somehow loses the nomination process, not very likely, but could happen. And you have Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, or Nikki Haley from South Carolina. These younger candidates would be first-term presidents, and they would be more restrained. They would have to be, because they would have to focus on re-election. So we all like to make predictions, and everybody likes to sort of guess about, what Trump would do and, whether President Trump would be very friendly toward Russia. But the truth is, what we know for a fact is that second-term presidents can take greater risks. First-term presidents have to be more restrained in foreign policy, and that's the most predictable dynamic over the period of uncertainty. And then once we know the outcome of the election, we can start to draw some other conclusions. And I would just point out that President Trump could very well reduce support for Ukraine, or a Republican leader could reduce support for Ukraine. But the reason for that is that they aren't likely to win unless there's been a recession. And in a post-recession environment, the U.S. might be, the new party would be telling households, we're going to reduce our foreign spending.
China has been somewhat quiet throughout this saga, and has not, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Chinese officials have not publicly commented on their thoughts on the mutiny in Russia. What do you think is going on in their mind?
Well, I think, first of all, China's the only power that can fill the power vacuum that is created by Russia's instability and decay. And that's the long-term geopolitical trend, is that China's going to be partnering with Russia. They have been, and forming a de facto alliance. And the reason for that is that both of them share the interest in preventing the U.S. from creating a global empire, pushing the U.S. out of their regions, creating a sphere of influence, and preventing the U.S. from turning smaller states into, wealthy democracies that are well armed. That was what Russia feared with Ukraine, and that's what China fears in the case of its neighbors, and particularly with Taiwan. They fear that the U.S. can basically hem China in with very powerful neighboring minor states. And so they're both pushing against that. China does not really have an interest in the failure of the Putin regime, because that would then lead to a reorientation of Russian policy toward the West. And then China would be the isolated international player. And so China will ultimately be forced to sort of support Russia. And of course, China wants to import cheap commodities from Russia, and Russia doesn't have any options, having reduced its relationship with Europe. And that's a long-term increase in China's supply security, which is of vital importance. So I think China will back Russia, and they have been, and that could ultimately lead to a greater confrontation between the U.S. and China, particularly if China provides lethal weapons, which Janet Yellen will be warning China against on her trip over to Beijing currently. So that's the key component here, is that China basically cannot reject Russia, and they're not necessarily happy with the way that Putin is guiding policy, but they can't really tell him no, because they have a shared enemy, which is the United States, and China is thoroughly convinced that the U.S. will be trying to contain China strategically in the coming decades.
Okay, so you brought up to me offline this détente issue between China and the U.S. That's not something I've heard from at least military officials in the U.S., which many of whom are expecting tensions to ramp up, especially in light of what appears to be Xi's objective to take Taiwan as soon as possible. So tell us about the overall U.S.-Sino relationships with the relations going on right now.
Yeah, well, I agree with those who say that there will not be a détente, at least not in the short term. Détente is a term of reduction of tensions that we get from the Cold War, And I think that could happen, but I don't think it will happen in any kind of significant or durable way until after the US election, because I think China needs the certainty of who is in charge in the US before they commit to any kind of deal. So, in other words, President Biden is trying to cut off China's semiconductors and then play nice ahead of his election. And I don't think Xi Jinping has an interest in granting him that favor unless he really pulls back on the enforcement of those export controls or cuts tariffs or something. Instead, China assumes that once Biden is reelected or once the U.S. election is over, U.S. policy will double down on a confrontational approach to China and a containment policy. And so with that expectation, there's very little room for China to offer concessions over the next year or 18 months. And that's why I don't think a détente is very viable in the short run. Also, détentes tended to happen after major crises where, for example, when the US and the Soviet Union would clash and come to the brink of war, then the fear of war would be enough to force them to sit down at the negotiating table and try to reduce tensions. But what we have today is a spiraling, an upward spiral of tensions between the U.S. and China that has not yet resulted in a major clash that brings that risk of war front and center and forces the public of both countries and forces the leaders of both countries to get more realistic. So until we have that, I think it's tough to bet on a détente. And instead, what we see is a rise in tensions. And even though Biden wants to maybe try to control the environment ahead of his election, he's not having much success. China has imposed sanctions on Micron. They're now saying that they will cut off mineral exports, some limited mineral exports that affect the semiconductor industry and renewable energy industries. And these things are signaling that the Chinese are really not buying this idea of a short-term reduction in tensions. China's economy is not very strong, so perhaps this can be part of a major negotiation where both sides make threats and then they reduce tensions ahead of the U.S. election simply because China wants to shore up their own economy. But we have yet to see that. And on the contrary, what we've seen is a continual escalation. And I think the reason is, like I said, structurally, China is well aware that in 2025, the U.S. will resume the process of strategic containment, and that's harmful to China's interests.
What's China's ultimate objective in the next 5 years? Well, let's just take 5 years.
Well, first of all, to your point earlier about the Taiwan situation, I do think that China has a lot of preparation to do still if they intend to wage any kind of full-scale war against Taiwan. So I don't think that's the objective. I think what they still would like to do is absorb Taiwan in some way, shape, or form. And I think they need the semiconductors for modernization, which means that they need to create a sort of miniature international system because the semiconductor supply chain is an international supply chain. That means they need, at minimum, South Korea and Taiwan to sort of be playing ball. And that's going to require a more nuanced policy than just invading, which, of course, would result in the destruction of the facilities that they're interested in. So, I think that this is not a full-scale invasion short run, and they've seen how badly Russia's performed. They've seen how much solidarity the West has shown in the face of Russia, and they've seen the performance of U.S. advanced weaponry. So they have a lot of reasons to go back to the drawing board, even if they were planning on aggression. So instead, what we'll see is aggression short of war. And a lot of that will hinge on the Taiwanese election in January, because if the nominally pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party is reelected in Taiwan, then you will see an escalation in tensions. China will basically start to apply more sustained economic punishment toward Taiwan to try to limit that administration and deter that administration from doing things with the United States that would cross China's lines. But if the Kuomintang party comes back into power in Taiwan, you could actually have a significant reduction in tensions because the two sides will engage in trade negotiations, and that will buy China time. So I think that the Taiwan election is critical. The U.S. election less so because the two parties resemble each other with regard to China. But once we get through that period of uncertainty, what we'll see is that China's playing a long game and preparing for the eventuality of conflict rather than preparing for an imminent invasion.
Do you see any evidence that Xi Jinping is in the same position as Putin, which is to say that he's also losing control over China?
Could happen because fundamentally the Chinese economy is slipping into a debt deflation trap. The middle class is going to be severely disappointed, and there is not a democratic mechanism for venting the frustrations of that middle class and altering policies. So this is a noxious combination, and it could very well result in widespread social unrest. We've been arguing that even prior to the fact that we did get nationwide social unrest targeting the Communist Party during the COVID riots last fall. So I think that thesis is strong, that you will see inequality and slower growth causing social instability and eventually political instability in China. But one major difference is that Xi Jinping rapidly set about consolidating power from the beginning of his term back in 2012. And so he's got 10 years of power consolidation under his belt because the party was afraid of this very dynamic I'm referring to. They were afraid of a Soviet-style collapse. The other thing is that Chinese people are not eager for the alternative. You know, they're not like begging for Western-style liberal democracy because they've seen the flaws of liberal democracy in our time, which is very different than during the Tiananmen Square period, where democracy was on the rise and a much more viable alternative. So I don't think that Xi Jinping is facing sort of immediate threats, but I do think over time we'll see those build up. The advantage he has over Putin is that the Chinese economy is still able to grow at least, 4% a year, whereas the Russian economy had basically completely stagnated, and it was stirring up that domestic instability, which was then causing that outward aggression. So if we get to a point where China has a recession, a real recession and real social unrest that's dividing the Communist Party, that's where I think Xi Jinping would be less secure and the regime would be less secure, and that could lead to erratic or irrational actions. But I don't think we're there yet, and I worry about that over the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Would you agree or disagree with the following statement, which is that the likelihood of another Tiananmen Square event is significantly lower today than it was 30 years ago because the living standards in China have significantly risen over the last 25 to 30 years, and so overall, because the Chinese citizen overall is better off, he or she is more content with how the regime is taking things in the direction that she wants to do. What do you think?
I don't really agree. I think that logic worked and held well in the 2000s, but now in the 2020s, we're in a new paradigm, and it's because of that slowdown of income growth, and also the slowdown in the economic model itself. And there is no new economic model yet. I mean, Xi Jinping is casting about trying to create that, and particularly he's investing a lot in technology, hoping for a sort of technological breakthrough that can cause a productivity boom and get through the middle income trap. But as we observe events, China is slipping into the middle income trap, and the middle class will be severely disappointed. And so to me, that points to social unrest. And like I indicated, high income inequality is another factor there that has led to unrest in the U.S. and in the U.K. and in Brazil. That these are effects that we see across multiple countries. So it won't, large scale social unrest in China today will not look like Tiananmen in the sense that they may not build, a model of the Statue of Liberty because they're not really demanding, U.S. style liberal democracy. But it could look like Tiananmen in the sense that you could have large groups of people, particularly youth, but maybe even workers, and they would be simply disillusioned with the latest turn in China's economy, which is a downward turn. And I think that's something we'll witness over the next 5 or 10 years.
Okay, so ultimately for the investor, which geopolitical hotspot do you think has the most impactful significance on the markets? Let's put it that way. We haven't had time to talk about the U.S. elections. We'll do that at another conversation. But just looking abroad, what's the biggest market moving event going on right now?
Well, right now, our key view for the year was that China's reopening would be disappointing. And that is the most important macro factor, is simply that China's growth has continued to disappoint, even though they removed the COVID restrictions. And that's because the COVID restrictions didn't affect the source of the problem, which is this decline in the property sector and decline in the investment-driven model of growth. And it's very hard to break out of that when you have corporations deleveraging and maybe even households deleveraging, afraid to take on new debt, afraid to spend, saving their money. And this is a result of the change of the economic model, the deterioration of governance under Xi Jinping, and the breakdown in foreign relations with the United States, which created a favorable international environment. And all those things are continuing. And so I think China's now going to provide some stimulus, and we'll probably see the Politburo announce that later this month in July. But that stimulus is less effective than it used to be. And China's already providing a lot more accommodation to the economy than people typically realize. So that could be sort of a flash in the pan. And what we find out is that the structural slowdown in China is just a remorseless process this year, next year, until deleveraging really sort of stabilizes and companies and households are willing to borrow. And that could be a very long process, judging by Japan and other countries. It's a huge disappointment to global growth. It's been already a huge disappointment to investors this year, those who were really excited about sort of global cyclical assets and commodities. And I think that that's the most important story. Other stories like, intensification of the Ukraine war, that's a risk factor, can bring some volatility, or instability in the Middle East, that's a risk factor and could even lead to an oil shock. But the big story and the most lasting story is the slowdown in the Chinese economy.
China, to my knowledge, is still very much an export-oriented economy, correct? And so what immediate impact is this going to have on the U.S. economy that they've slowed down more than anticipated?
Yeah, so exports make up almost 20% of GDP, which is not nearly as overexposed to exports as they were in the past. And really, you could say it's not overexposed to exports, but it is still true what you're saying, which is that the economy is still cyclical. It's a manufacturing-oriented economy, and investment goes into manufacturing, and so investment has slowed down. And really, when you take manufacturing and construction together, property together, what you see is a big drop in investment in the economy, and that's a problem. So that's the underlying thing. But yeah, the impact on the U.S. is that, well, first of all, global growth has slowed down generally. And that means that the export side of China's economy has been weak. The other factor there is trying to reaccelerate. Well, we've seen consumers be pretty resilient in the West. The problem is that they now have a restrictive monetary policy in the U.S. and Europe, and that's going to prevent them from reaccelerating in a major way, which means that the exports will remain subdued in China. So it's not really a way to get out of their problem. The solution, and they know this in China, is to boost household consumption and consumerism, but they haven't been able to make that transition. And it has to do with those same issues that I pointed out earlier, particularly that the Communist Party is reluctant to transfer wealth from state-owned enterprises and local governments to the people and create a new class of private entrepreneurs and private wealth. They're not willing to do that, and that's preventing consumerism from being unleashed. And that's simply a story that continues to weigh on Chinese growth.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matt, for your time. And where can we learn more about your work and read your thoughts?
BCA Research. We're publishing all the time, both on geopolitics and U.S. Policy, and that's going, of course, to ramp up in the 2024 election cycle. Taiwan, Russian elections, U.S. elections, Indian elections. Next year is sort of the year of elections, and as we enter the second half of 2023, that policy uncertainty is going to be rising around the world.
Excellent. All right, we'll put a link in the description down below where people can access this research. Thank you very much, Matt, for your time today. I look forward to speaking with you next time.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.